everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of What's on Your Mind. I'm your host, Mimari Belu, or That African Butterfly, as I'm known on social media. I'm so excited about my guest today. We talk about mental health all the time here. And this month it is Pride Month, so we're especially focusing on community members and people within the community who identify as LGBTQIA+. And today I have Francisco Moreno with us. They are a local organizer and communications professional here in Delaware. They're passionate about intersectional approaches to developing community leaders and honoring community voices. They have been really busy with policy change already and advocating for it here in Delaware to outlaw size discrimination. They're on the NAFA board of directors and recently celebrated 1 year as a trainer and educator at the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. They have a bachelor's in criminal justice and women and gender studies from the University of Delaware. And they are the founder of the Delaware Fat Collective. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That's an impressive resume. Did I forget anything? Did I leave anything out? Anything you want to share with the people?
No, I think that's enough.
Okay, well, to kick things off, you're the founder of the Delaware Fat Collective. Can you tell us what your inspiration was for creating that?
Of course. So I was heavily inspired to create the Delaware Fat Collective because of existing groups in the United States for fat people. So in Philadelphia, they have a Philly Fat Babe group where there's a really well-established Facebook group where they share tips, they share insecurities, concerns. They have an entire list of medical providers that are fat-friendly in Philadelphia. And as I started getting more and more involved in fat liberation, and that was probably, I would say, in 2020 to 2021, I started thinking, why doesn't Delaware have something like this? Because we're a small state. It should be easy for us to access resources. It should be easy for us to come together. We're only 3 counties. Pennsylvania is much larger.
Right.
And so that's why I decided to at least create an Instagram to start us off, something, so that we can start organizing ourselves and just having some sort of community.
I love that. And it's interesting because if you're not really tapped into what I call like the plus size community, you don't realize how much of a community there actually is there. I remember going to like my first plus size event and my first just different activities. And it's a whole different feeling of being around people. And it's a different level of comfort that you don't realize is missing until you're in that space.
Yeah. And I also want to point out before we keep going that you might notice I use the word fat. I mean, you don't have to identify as fat to be a part of the collective or to be a part of any of these movements or groups that I'm going to be talking about. Some people feel more comfortable identifying as plus size. Some people feel more comfortable identifying as curvy. I use the word fat because it's mostly been used pejoratively or like negatively for most of history. But a lot of people are using that word and reclaiming it as their own because it's usually been used against them or to label them. But a lot of people have started identifying as fat to be like, it's just a descriptor. This is just describing how my body looks, and my body is not the most interesting thing about me.
Yes, and I love that. I was actually going to ask you about that, the choice to use the word fat, because it's really off-putting for some people, and then some people it's very embracing. And I think it's because we definitely grew up in a time where like that was negative. That's like, it wasn't a description. It was negative. Like, I feel fat, you feel down. I feel fat, you feel like whatever the negative way of how you felt, either emotionally or about your body, it was insert the word fat there. So then it's always been this like negative word when, as you said, it's just a descriptor.
Right. If I had someone call me fat in high school, that would have ruined my whole month, day, year, everything. That would have ruined my life in high school, even beginning of college. Like, the word fat was something that I was so afraid of my entire life. I grew up in a family with a fat mom and a fat sister and a lot of plus size family members. And it was just something that it was the worst thing was to be fat. So now to embrace that, it's just completely freed me, I think, of a lot of negativity that I felt growing up about my body.
It's so interesting that you say that because I am the exact opposite. Everyone in my family is pretty thin. I, like on my dad's side, but I don't really. They're in Liberia, but like on my mom's side where I grew up, like my younger brother and sister look like models, literally.
Mm-hmm.
So like I've always been the only one who was more plus size, and I always would have thought like. So it's for me, it's interesting hearing you say that it was such a bad word because you would think. I think a lot of people think like, oh, if you grow up around it, then that's a more comfortable space because everyone is versus like the odd man out.
Yeah, I mean, some of the most hateful or fat phobic people are fat people. And a lot of it is because it is not easy growing up fat. It's not. It's not easy. There's a lot of bullying. I did a research study my senior year of college. My senior thesis was about fat students in higher education and the inclusion or not inclusion of them. Almost all of the participants I interviewed from around the country and around the world, including Canada and India, were bullied. One of them was bullied. A few of them were bullied so bad that they left the schools that they were at and had to transfer schools because they were bullied so much for being fat. And actually, funny enough, so I grew up when I was younger, I was fat. Then I lost a lot of weight in middle school and high school. So for that period of time, I lived my life as thin. It wasn't until I went to college that I started gaining weight and then became fat. So I've been through a lot of phases with my body throughout my life. So I was actually the thin one in my family for a short-ish period of time. So that's the thing too, is people's bodies change throughout their lives, and I feel like that's just natural for your body to change as you get older.
It's totally natural. And I've learned also not to comment on people's bodies because a lot of times, I mean, there are times where someone has, made a weight loss goal and they're working towards it and like, it, then yes, congratulate them. Whoop, whoop. But there's so many times if you talk to people and they'll say like the thinnest point of my life was the worst point of my life. And
Yeah.
we live in a society that loves and praises thinness so much that they get compliments left and right about how great they look. Meanwhile, they're dealing with like the worst crisis ever, but they just
Yeah.
happen to physically look good compared to stereotypes.
Yeah. When I was thin, I had an eating disorder. I was in an abusive home environment, which is, part of my story is that I'm a survivor of domestic violence, familial violence. Uh, that was definitely the worst time of my life was when I was thin. And that's not true for everyone. And also, I think it's okay for people to go on, people will do diets. It's hard to not. There's so much weight loss um advertisement. The weight loss industry is huge. It profits off of us hating ourselves and our bodies. Like when someone's talking about their diet, that's fine, you can do that. I just don't want to hear about it personally because again, I think there are more interesting things to talk about than our bodies. And yeah, that's what I'll say about that. There's so much to say about the weight loss industry, but that's like a whole other conversation.
Yeah, no, but you're absolutely right. And it really is engulfed in us. And when we talk about like our mental health and how that impacts us, I was actually just talking to someone in a meeting earlier today, and I'm going to do a live on my Instagram about it. But I realized that after milestones, because you just had your 1 year, I just had my first 1 year as a full-time entrepreneur, which was exciting. But I find that like usually after a milestone, I have like a week where I just kind of like spiral into a pit of like loathing and self-hate. And I really just identified that recently that happens every time. And it's because like after I have the, oh, you did great, I tend to focus on all the things that I didn't do and the things that I didn't accomplish. And I realized like yesterday or the other day that like most of those things reverted back to like my size, right? So it's like I could have accomplished everything else on my list and done all these quick, like, kick butt things, but because I didn't meet my fitness goals, in my mind, I'm just a failure. And so then it like goes like I cycle through that every year. And it's, like you said, it's our environment, it's the weight loss industry, but there really is something that kind of puts it out there that unless you get I mean, yes, for health purposes, but more also the way they put it for aesthetic purposes, unless you aesthetically are okay, then you're not okay. And that really,
Sorry, I lost you for a second.
okay. I see it freezing a little bit.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, yeah, there's so many reasons why people choose to lose weight, and I don't judge people either. When I say I don't want to hear about somebody's diet, it's just because for me personally, I struggled so much with disordered eating. It's triggering for me to hear about somebody's diet. And also, no offense, I just don't find talking about like what people's workout routines. I dated someone who was a bodybuilder for a long time,
Mhm.
and like
Yeah.
I don't know. I like working out. I like moving my body. I love to roller skate. I like doing things that bring me energy and make me feel like I'm moving my body in a
Mhm.
fun way. I
Yeah.
walk a lot. I don't drive, so I walk everywhere. I take the bus everywhere. So it really just depends on the person, but it's more that I mean, and I completely understand why people want to lose weight. I mean, especially growing up in a family where body size was a very common topic of discussion. Your family is telling you, your sometimes friends, teachers would comment on my body size as a child in elementary school and say, "Wow, you've lost weight. You look amazing." Meanwhile, I wasn't eating. So it's not just the weight loss industry. It's like you're getting it from all angles. So I understand why people lose weight. For some people, doctors are a big source of fat phobia or reasons why they don't like their bodies. The BMI, the body mass index, is a big reason why I wasn't eating because it's not very accurate and that like even though I want to say like a size 4, I was considered overweight. It didn't matter how small I was still somehow considered overweight by doctors. So, yeah, there's really so many like yeah, so many different ways we get told that we're just too big.
Yep. And then on top of that, there's all of the other parts of our identity and things that we have to deal with as well. For you, like, how do you address the intersection of mental health with other aspects of identity, such as like race or gender or socioeconomic status?
Well, I think sometimes, and this is the whole point of intersectionality, is not seeing people's identities as silos and as just individual things like I am just Latina or I am just queer. Like I am Latina and I'm queer and I'm fat and how all of those are interconnected. And then when talking about mental health, it's so important to consider all of those aspects of somebody's identity because access to mental health is so difficult. Even somebody like myself, who I went to school for domestic violence prevention and services, I would say I'm pretty well connected and I understand how get support and access to counseling. And yet it took me 4 years almost to find a therapist. It's hard. And I had insurance, health insurance. So there's I mean, that's kind of a big question. Like there's so many reasons why people from certain communities, especially communities of color or queer communities, it's not just like being able to afford it or have health insurance, but it's also sometimes the like stigmas that come with accessing it. Like for example, growing up, you just didn't talk about your mental health. And I've noticed this with other Latino families, but if you talk about your mental health, you're a crazy person. I mean, I don't love that word, but that's how they would call you. And like this was a practice that didn't happen that long ago, but you would get sent to literally a farm if you had mental health issues. I mean, my family's from Honduras, and so that didn't happen in the US, but I'm just saying that wasn't that long ago. That still might happen, that if you even talk about feeling sad or feeling down, you get sent away. So that's just one example of why it's difficult for certain communities to get access to mental health. That's a huge conversation.
It really, yeah, it's one of those where there's just so many different parts to it. But I think what you mentioned that, people aren't silos and there are different parts of your identity aren't individual. It all meshes together. I think that that's really important when trying to have those conversations. With the Delaware Fat Collective, and actually even your work with domestic violence, like how do you create a safe and inclusive environment for people to have these types of conversations about how they're dealing with it, whether it's physical, mental, whatever?
Yeah, and before I answer that question, I wanted to just validate what somebody said in the comments. Isabel said that they remember when they gave birth to their daughter that people constantly brought up attention to weight gain. That's so big for people that can get pregnant. I mean, you're literally carrying an entire human being. Like, yes, you're going to gain weight. And there's this whole culture of like, snap back to your body. I can't even, like, I don't even want to get into that. That is so
Right.
wild to me that people expect people to lose weight after giving birth to another human being. So I just wanted to validate what you said in the chat. To answer your question, how to make a safe space for having difficult conversations is something that I have to do a lot at work, because at work I am a trainer on domestic violence, and that is a very, very emotional topic for a lot of people. I mean, the statistics don't lie. Most people have experienced or know someone who's experienced domestic violence. And so one of the things that I find really useful, the first thing I do when I have a conversation that might be uncomfortable for people. Hi, my cat wants to join. Goodbye. I love you. Goodbye. One of the first things I do is set group agreements, because you're really creating like a space, whether that's virtual or physical, and just group agreements. I set some agreements that I kind of see as non-negotiables, like this is what you need to have a safe as possible conversation. And then I throw it back to the group, like, what are your norms? Because how am I going to expect people to follow my agreements or norms if I don't give them the opportunity to share theirs? So that's one of the biggest things I do, is kind of just setting the stage for like, this is how this conversation is going to go. And then also letting people share their insights about how they want it to go too. And then there's always, sometimes people say things that are not appropriate, or they say things that people would normally think like, huh, that's kind of rude or that's kind of ignorant. But as a trainer, I have to let people say things like that, because it's like important to make mistakes. You can't always get it right. And I give people grace in those settings, because especially if this is the first time you're hearing about domestic violence or you're hearing about fat liberation, you're going to make mistakes. So I usually just say something like, can you tell me more about what you just said? Or what do you mean by that? Then usually as they start to explain what they said, they start to realize that, oh, okay, maybe what I just said wasn't the most appropriate. And if they don't realize it, then sometimes their peers in the group will be like, excuse me, you can you like, okay, let's calm down. So those are just some things I've learned.
No, that's great. And that's actually such a perfect transition into my other question, which is like, how do you address the topic of mental health stigma, especially in relations to like discrimination and marginalization when it comes to body size and sexual identity? I'm sure it's stuff that comes up for you in your different spaces. And I know one of the ways you just mentioned was having them repeated. I think that that's great. Is there any other ways that either you address it or that we could address it if we notice it?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think it's important to validate when someone tells you, like, this is the reason why I'm not accessing care. Like, I've worked a lot with the Latino community in Wilmington and in Delaware statewide, and I've heard people say similar things to what my family would say, like, if you talk about mental health, you're crazy. Or I've heard people, I don't know, just some things that I'm sure some people can relate to, where it's like, okay, that's not exactly accurate, but just validating, like, yeah, I've heard that too. Like my family, I'm sorry, I'm like trying to keep my cat, and she really wants to join this. She's probably going to jump back up. Just validating, like, yeah, I've heard that before too. My family used to say that. I actually learned this. Sometimes, having some statistics ready. People like statistics. I'm not a huge statistics person, because I think they're flawed because they're created by people, but whatever, that's my own opinion. But statistics can be really helpful. And then not making them feel like an idiot for asking a question and for saying something, because that's a really good moment for a learning opportunity.
Yes, yes. That is such a huge one. It's a pet peeve of mine that people act like everyone should be woke. Like the whole purpose of it and the whole meaning of woke is that at some point you have to awaken from not knowing. So like
Right.
everyone doesn't know everything. And most of the time, people don't know what they don't know, which makes it even harder. So I
Yeah.
feel like if you have the opportunity, I mean, obviously, if someone comes at you crazy,
Yeah,
you
I was just gonna say, like, if someone is just saying like anything and they don't seem like they're willing to have a conversation yet, I mean, they might in the future, who knows? But if they don't seem like they're willing to have a conversation about it, you don't have to, as a person that wants to make change, you don't have to decide that to take on every single
yes,
person. Like, you have to decide for yourself because, like, I use they, them pronouns. A lot of people don't, for the most part, are not always accepting of that. They don't always use my pronouns. And there are some people who are willing to have a conversation about it, and that's great. And I love those people and I keep them close to me. There are some people who don't care about actually what I have to say, and I can't fight that fight all the time because it's exhausting and it can feel painful. It might not feel painful in the way that people like feel when you get punched, but it feels painful in the sense that that night I'm probably going to pass out early, or the next day I'm going to feel really low.
mm-hmm.
There's just our body keeps, there's a book called The Body Keeps Score. People mention it a lot in the field.
Yeah.
Your body really does keep score though. So even if someone's saying something's painful, they don't necessarily mean it in like a they just got gut punched way. Sometimes that is true. But like when you are experiencing violence or like discrimination, like your body's going to keep score of that and it's going to add up, and then one day it's going to hit you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that learning that discernment, especially if you're going to get into a space where you're a quote unquote activist about anything, is so vitally important. It's something that I've had to work on. Well, I'm a bleeding heart, so I want to care about every cause and help everyone. So I had to narrow myself down to like 5 things. And then after that, I had to really sort of learn, especially because I do a lot in the social space. Really had to learn the difference between someone who wants to engage in conversation and someone who just wants to troll. Because I'm one of those people who feels like if someone, because a lot of people say like, oh, don't engage in comments, but you can have conversations with people in comments. And I'm one of those like, hey, if you change one person's mind or if you help one person see, like that makes a difference. And I have to think on a small level because when I think larger, everything feels kind of hopeless and like nothing changes. But if you focus on like the little changes that you can make, but learning that discernment is so important. So you're not knocking your head against the wood trying to talk to someone who, like you said, isn't trying to hear you. They just want to speak themselves.
Yeah. And going back to something you mentioned about people have to awaken at some point, that's the whole point, is that we lose a lot of people sometimes, I think, when we say, well, what you just said was ridiculous and we're cutting you off completely. We're canceling you, I guess you could say. And yes, there are some people who should be cut off because there might be trolling, as you said, or they might not be willing to have a conversation. But I think there are some people who make mistakes who genuinely just need to be educated. It's important to find people in our communities that are willing to do education because it's exhausting, who are willing to put in that work to say, hey, what you just said wasn't cool, but let's have a conversation about it. And then, you know, try to welcome them back in because we need people. We need people with us, alongside us. And we lose a lot of people, I think, by just cutting them off when they make a mistake. And I'm just going to close my door real quick. I'll be right back.
Okay. While she's closing her door, thank you for everyone who's joined. I'm going to go through some of the comments. Scroll up. Izzy said definitely getting it from all angles, and that's when we were talking about size and how people have comments no matter which direction they're coming from. Charles said we need to get rid of the BMI chart. It is way off. True. We talked about the comment about after giving birth. Said hello, John Spring. Yes, we don't talk about mental health in my community as well. And I truly believe that if we dealt with mental health issues and getting the help people need, we would solve a lot of problems that we have as a society. And I agree as well. I think the dismissiveness we have of it is the problem. And I always find it so interesting now that we are talking about more mental health issues and behavioral health issues, you'll constantly see like the people who are like, we didn't have all of this back in my day. Yeah, you did. It just wasn't really identified, or people were, doing masking. Like a lot of people say, like, oh, this, people who weren't depressed, or people didn't have anxiety, or there was an autism. It's like, well, people are masking and hiding a lot of the stuff. But as far back as you go, someone will say like, oh, that one-off kid in the neighborhood, or the weird uncle, or the down this, like we've all had those people in our lives before. It's just that now we're getting to a place where people feel more okay to talk about it, which I think is good. Let's see here. All right, and you're back. So I wanted to ask you as well, what challenges have you had when advocating, whether it be for queer rights or for body size, even in domestic, well, yeah, even in the domestic violence area, but like, what challenges have you faced when advocating for those rights, and like, how do you overcome them?
That's a really good question that could have a really long answer, but I'll talk about the fat activism first. Well, one, it's difficult because of language. We talked about in the beginning, not everyone identifies as fat. And a lot of people are still pretty hateful towards fat people. If you dare to look on some Facebook comments of some viral posts about, there was this post about like, what if Disney princesses were fat? And someone, I'm pretty sure, used like AI to make the Disney princesses fat. Whatever. It went viral and the comments are horrible. The comments say things like they would probably die of insert disease here that we know is not related to body size. There's still a lot of hate towards people that are celebrities that are fat, who are quote unquote glorifying obesity when really they're just existing. A good example, or I guess a bad example, would be Lizzo. I say bad example because she receives so much hate. She never said that she was a fat activist. She never said that she believed in fat liberation. She's really just a fat person. And I mean, if you're talking about intersectionality, she's also a Black woman. And so all of those identities, I mean, her comments are horrible too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard because people just are not ready to be free of their ideas of what a body is supposed to look like. So that's really difficult. There's a lot of trolls when it comes to talking about embracing people's bodies. And really, what people want is just body neutrality. And learning about body neutrality for me really helped free myself of feeling like I had to be either super negative or super positive. Body positivity is a whole other conversation we could have about how you're supposed to feel like this confident, beautiful, sexy, whatever every day. That's just not possible. Like sometimes you just need to get through your day and feel neutral about yourself.
You're right.
Yeah. So those are the challenges I see. Usually trolls are people who aren't happy with themselves. I mean, I was looking through some of those comments of the Disney princess post, for example, and a lot of the people that were commenting were also fat and plus sized.
Yeah.
Not surprising. They probably don't feel great, which is, you know. And then you asked about challenges with the queer community. There's so many, especially now that there's a lot of legislation being passed right now that is anti-trans and anti um like there's drag bans, there's all kinds of legislation that's being passed right now in a lot of states, and it's really interesting in a bad way how quickly these pieces of legislation are being passed. Like there's a really interesting, again, in a bad way, map that the ACLU made where within just less than a year, there was like it shows it from like safe places to live as a trans person to unsafe, and the less safe, the more red a state looks. Not related to party, I'm just gonna say that so people know what I'm talking about. And within just a couple of months, like so many states turned dark red.
Yeah. Yeah.
And only a couple of months. So it's just really scary right now. to be out as a person that is gender nonconforming. So there's barriers in the sense of like legislation, there's barriers. There's a lot of scary things that have happened in life in the past decade and the past year, like shootings at gay clubs. Yesterday was the anniversary of Pulse, the nightclub shooting that happened in Florida, which was a mainly Latino and Black gay club where I think 49 people were killed.
Yeah.
So it's not just legislation, it's also people just being straight up violent towards gay people.
Violent and
So,
hateful.
yeah. So any space I go into that's specifically gay, I feel really scared. And that's just true. In Delaware, I feel scared. I've been called slurs. So yeah, we're just not as some people will say like, well, all these gay people, they already have rights. They're allowed to get married, this and that. And like if you know anything about laws, you know that just because something has been passed doesn't mean that it's being put into action. Doesn't mean that people are following that. Just because we have marriage equality, just because we have you are not allowed to discriminate somebody on the basis of sexual orientation, it still happens.
Right. Yeah, and it happens. It makes me so upset, honestly. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier, where I have to focus on the small, because if I focus on the larger picture, it makes me really upset because it's like how it's 2024, and I feel like we should be further enough along that we shouldn't feel like we're reverting back, but that's what it absolutely feels like. And it's frustrating because I think before you could say, like, oh, well, there was a lack of knowledge, there was a lack of information. Like now we have knowledge and information at your fingertips from, everything to the fact of like people under these identities have been around for centuries.
Right.
Straight up to the fact that like it's stuff in your brain. Like they've actually shown it as people are born a certain way, and yet we still have people who want to fight against it because it goes against their personal moral code. And I find that that's so interesting, the way that people feel like everyone has to sort of adhere to what they have decided is their moral code, and whether we're talking about like sexuality or size, because a lot of times people will attach morality to someone's size, right? Like there's like, oh, the 7 deadly sins or whatever. So now they've assigned it to your size. And if you're bigger, then you lack morals or discipline or all the other things they want to put next to you, which someone who's slim might have all the same issues. They just don't show it physically. And so like, I feel like with that, and then with sexual identity, it's like people want to put their personal morals. They can't just say like, oh, I personally am against this, so it's not cool. It's like, well, nobody, if I can't do it, nobody can. And it's made it, like you said, like it hurts hearing you say that you're scared, because I also know like how valid that is. And I know that there's a lot of people feel that way. And if we're being honest, it makes me livid, like livid, when I think about the fact that there are people who are scared just because other people don't like to feel uncomfortable. Because that's really what it is. No one's forcing anybody to be gay. No one's saying like you have to. It's literally that there are groups of people who feel uncomfortable by the sexuality of others, and they want to squash that down. And their efforts to squash that down has led to other people being more fearful of their lives, which is just uncalled for and very frustrating.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. One is there's the argument of people just decide that they're gay. You hear that a lot. I'm sure this is something that people have heard a lot, and but for just so you all know, I identify as bisexual. It's interesting because I'm dating a woman right now. People assume that I'm a lesbian, but that's not how I identify. Shout out to the lesbians, love them, but I'm bisexual. Anyways, I've known that I was not straight since as long as I can remember having thoughts, which is really
This is
interesting to say.
common, by the way. I
It
have to
is super
say.
common, yeah.
Yeah, like because I've been doing interviews for a while, for a few years now, and I especially try to do like Pride ones. Like last
Yeah,
month I did like, or last year I did like 3 a week for the
yeah.
whole month. Almost every person I spoke to said they knew from childhood
Oh,
that they.
yeah, like, I mean, I can't pinpoint a time in my life where I didn't know. I didn't come out until I was graduated or about to graduate from high school. So, I mean, honestly, I'm, like, still relatively newly out if you think about, like, life. And I only didn't come out because, one, my household, I don't want to be dramatic, but I probably would have been very severely hurt or killed. And I don't mean to be dramatic, but that's true. And also, I grew up very religious, not because anyone made me religious, by the way. I was just very religious myself. I found a lot of comfort in religion when I was younger. And I also have always been a lifelong performer. So I would sing in the church choir. And I'm not here to say like all religion is bad or I hated being religious, because I actually really found a lot of love and like joy, especially in the performance parts of religion. But there was one day when I was in my after school, like I grew up Catholic school, where they legitimately had a test question that said, "Are gay people going to hell, true or false?" And the answer was true. But I just remember sitting there as someone who had known my whole life that I was gay, but never had verbalized that because I was so scared. I said false anyways, because I was like, I don't believe that. But I mean, just recently, the Pope said it twice, a slur. So, anyways, I've known my whole life that I was gay. I just didn't feel safe to say that. And to talk about feeling scared, I mean, every time I hold my girlfriend's hand in public, I'm scared that there's a possibility that someone could hurt us. I mean, there was a story in New York, which is known as a very safe, mostly place for queer people. This couple was holding hands on the subway, these two women, and this guy just came up and punched them in the face and just beat them up for just holding hands, and I think spat on them or something. Like,
Yeah.
so it's really, when people say things like it's okay if people are gay, just not in front of me, like that kind of stuff is not just words, it does translate to violence. So when people just say like it's just words, it doesn't hurt, and I'm like, well, if the wrong person hears that and they internalize that message and say, well, yeah, it shouldn't be in front of me, then they end up shooting up nightclubs or punching random people on the subway that are literally just holding hands.
Right. And a part of it is, we talked a little bit about, so a while ago, I had a sex therapist on, and we talked about the importance of sex education at younger ages. And a
Yeah.
lot of people instantly think about, like, oh, the word sex is in there, so we're talking about sex. But it's not that. It's about so much more than that, as far as like identifying with your body, and also just like recognizing things like love is love. And people will try to say, like, oh, you're trying to put like the agenda on them. But it's all learned behaviors, right? Like, we grew up learning, like, oh, it's just hetero and it's just this. But then, as they say, when you know better, you do better. So if we know biologically that there are people, because really sexuality is a spectrum. And I won't get on my sexuality as a spectrum soapbox, but it is like like so much of us think like it's like, oh, you're gay, you're straight, it's that. But really, most people are like somewhere fluctuating a little bit. But because you're not taught that growing up, when people do fluctuate, A, they freak out, like, oh my goodness, why am I attracted to this person? It's like, no, you're just human. But B, that what I was saying before, like, a lot of people's problem is that uncomfortable feeling. And I think also, like, I recognize it because, like, I grew up super religious as well, and African background, so the immigrant struggle, right? Like, we know it. And so, like, really, and my mom, as far as being an immigrant and all of that, was as open-minded as she could be.
Mhm.
Um, but I was still like, so I would still get like a little bit of like a when I would see certain things, and like that's died down. But the way that dies down is by exposing yourself to it and by letting yourself know, like, love is love. Like, so seeing two people holding hands that are the same sex won't give you the ick. If you've learned that it's just two people holding hands, it's not that big of a deal. And people make it out to be a bigger deal, and then it makes it into a problem.
Yeah. Oh, there was something I was thinking about, but well, I will say, like I said, I wasn't forced to be religious by anyone. You know, some people will say, like, my parents made me go to church. I would make my mom go to church because I wanted to sing in the choir. My
Mm-hmm.
dad actually, even though he's an immigrant, is not religious at all. He's just kind of a jerk. So that's my dad. But Yeah, when it comes to talking about sex therapy, that's a whole other topic that I'm really passionate about. Not
Mhm.
sex therapy, yes, but sex education.
Yeah,
Because some people, like you said, when they hear sex education for kids, they think, oh my God, you're going to show my kid porn.
right,
No. Has that ever happened to you in school? If it has, that is child abuse.
right,
What people are talking about is something as simple as this is your penis, this is your vagina, these are breasts, like these are your breasts, this is your chest, stuff like that. Because one of the big reasons why people advocate for that is because of child sexual abuse, because
yeah,
unfortunately it does happen.
mhm,
And for example, if a child has been abused, and there's a lot of different words. I mean, it's always funny to talk about. There's a lot of different words for genitals. You grow up, I mean, especially in the Latino community, there's like a million words for vagina. So
mhm,
if a child has been sexually abused and they don't know the language to describe what happened to them, let's say, for example, they go to school the next day and they say, my blank ate my cookie. Okay, well, a cookie is a cookie, right? But if that child is talking about their vagina and they don't have the word for it, how is an adult, a trusted, safe adult, able to flag that for child sexual abuse?
right,
Then that kid is not getting the support and resources that they need or getting that adult away from that child. That's not happening because they don't have the language to say that. So there's age appropriate comprehensive sex education that people advocate for.
yeah,
And it can be also as simple as I do teen dating violence workshops. What's the difference between liking someone and loving someone? That is comprehensive sex education.
yep,
Knowing what does it mean to love someone versus liking someone.
mhm.
Love your family, you might like a friend. I don't know. So stuff like that. It
No, and
doesn't
I think that all of that is so important. And I can't, if you're watching this, I really do urge you to go back and watch the episode with Dr. Lex, because we did it for Child Abuse Awareness Month, and she talked about a lot of those things. And something that she said, because I've also always heard, like telling your kids the right name for their private parts is
Mhm.
part of preventing child abuse. And a lot for the reasons that you said, but something that she mentioned that I'd never really thought of was that because she knows how she speaks to her children about those parts, when someone brings up a part, like when her child mentions a part using one of those words like a cookie or whatever,
Yeah.
it allows her to flag that someone's been talking to her child about that region, and she can
Mm,
then figure out like, oh, was it like in that case it was that the kid had to like watch something on TV, but she was able to go like, oh, where did you hear that word? Because then she also, because grooming is a huge thing, unfortunately. So knowing that like, oh, she would be able to clock it if like, oh, an adult had talked to a child about it because they're using that word that the parent didn't use with them, I think is definitely vital.
yeah, and this is the last, I guess, well, because I don't want to get too off track. I know, like, technically this isn't about sex education, but I always tell people too, like, if you think anyone that's listening right now, think about the first time you learned about sex. Where? Was it YouTube? Was it another kid? Was it from a porn site? And like really think about when was the first time you learned about sex? And most people will say, not school, not a teacher, not my parents. And so kids are going to learn about sex one way or another. Would you rather them learn it from another 7-year-old, or would you rather them learn it from someone who's an expert on the topic?
Right.
I don't know about you all, but I prefer the expert because I don't I have very vivid memories of being in middle school and having middle school teenage boys telling me about watching porn. And that was the first time I learned what sex was. And then I had a really weird relationship with sex for the rest of my life and continues today. So that's what I always like to tell people too is like, who do you want them to hear it from?
Yeah,
Because
and that
they will
impacts
hear about it.
it growing up, especially like as we mentioned earlier, circling back to sexual identity. Most people who are anywhere on the spectrum just outside of pure straightness, whether they're bi, pans, gay, whatever, they are also now surrounded by people who are speaking to them only on hetero language terms, so thinking that anything they're into, I'm sure, is internalized as being wrong or awkward. And I think it's definitely something that people struggle with. And do you ever, within your work or even on the side of dealing with body issues, like, do you have any advice that you would give to someone who's sort of struggling internally with that internalized stigma that we kind of all deal with, whether it's about their body or their sexuality?
Yeah, I would recommend talking to someone about it. I'm not saying you have to talk to a therapist. I like therapy, but it's not for everyone. Like, really, it's not. Some people don't think it's helpful. That's fine. I like therapy personally, but just talk to someone about it. Anyone. Talk to a friend, just have somewhere where you can say the words out loud to somebody else. I am struggling with my body. I'm struggling. I haven't been, eating, whatever it is. I'm struggling with my mental health. Just tell someone that you trust. Hopefully their response will be supportive if it's a friend that cares for you and loves you. That's one of my recommendations. That's how we've gotten as far as we've gotten when it comes to mental health, is just simply talking about it. I say simply, it's not that easy. It's not easy when you've been struggling your whole life and you feel like trapped in your own mind. It's not easy and it's not simple, but talking to anyone about it, again, it doesn't have to be a therapist. The second thing I would say is, I know you're a big communication social media person. One of the best ways I started connecting with myself more when it came to my body size was finding resources online through social media. TikTok, funny enough, was the first time I had to reconcile with the fat phobic ideas I had. And what I mean by that is, like, I saw a video, I all of a sudden I was connected to all of these people who had different perspectives from me about body size. And by the way, this was in 2020. I wasn't going around being like, I hate fat people. I hate, blah 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 blah. But I did have a lot of like hatred for my own body, and sometimes you think things and you don't believe them, but you think them. And TikTok was the first time I saw people that weren't being like, I hate myself and I'm going to lose weight. I was suddenly seeing people who were like, my body's cool. We're cool with each other, body neutrality. And then I started to think like, oh, this is interesting. Like, I saw someone call themselves fat and I was like, oh my God, I'm scandalized. You called yourself fat. That's so horrible. Why would you think that about yourself? You know,
Right.
the reaction that many people have when you say I'm fat, they're like, oh my God, no, you're not fat. You're this.
Yes. No, you're not. Yeah.
But seeing someone call themselves fat, I was like, oh, wait, why am I so uncomfortable with that? Why do I feel like, why is my body on like survival mode all of a sudden just because someone called themselves fat? And so then I started looking into NAFA. That's how I found NAFA, because I looked up, I probably looked up something like fat people calling themselves fat or something like that. Who knows? I Googled something and then I found NAFA, which is the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. It's a national organization that is dedicated to basically improving the lives of fat people through legislation, through advocacy, through community building. And I was like, whoa, there's a whole organization dedicated to this? That's crazy. I didn't think that was a thing. Now I'm on the board of directors for NAFA, which is still just a dream come true. But yeah, just seeking out people that think. I know they say don't be in a bubble, but if this is the first time you're thinking like, okay, I'm uncomfortable and I want to learn more, then follow people that are experts in that.
Yes, yes. And that's something I really preach on social media, because it's the one thing that I love about social media. It's also frustrating, but you really can create the world that you see. The more you engage with things, the more you see it. The less you engage, the less you see it. So it's always interesting to me when people complain about certain things they see online all the time. I'm like, you're seeing it because you're clicking on it or you're commenting on it. Like, you're actively bringing that negativity into your space. And so same thing with this, because I had to go on sort of the same journey too, where I actively sought out people who were comfortable with their bodies and sought out people who were more positive, to help have that mindset and that mind shift change. And it is nice having it out there. And it's not all, like you said, about being super positive all the time. Sometimes it's just about being neutral. Sometimes it's just like, listen, this is my body. It is what it is. And I don't feel like I should take on everyone's judgment because of my body, right? Like
Yeah.
the fact that you have to say like, hey, just because you don't like fat people doesn't mean you can be rude to me like that. Like someone's body size is not indicative, it should not be indicative of how you treat them as a human being. And that's really what fat liberation is. People act like fat liberation is saying like everybody should be fat. That's not what it is. It's
No.
saying regardless of the size of someone, treat them with dignity and respect because
And they
everyone
deserve rights, the same rights as everyone else.
yeah.
And what did you say that reminded me of something? Well, one, I wanted to say that exercise in general of feeling uncomfortable and questioning that discomfort is really helpful for anything. And it can maybe reveal things about yourself that you didn't realize. Like I said, I heard someone call themselves fat and I was like, oh my God, that's horrific. How could you say that? But then I started questioning that. And then I started realizing things about my own self. And the other thing that's wonderful about body neutrality is I was so obsessed with my body size that it was to the point where it was debilitating. I couldn't do anything without thinking, is this going to make me lose or gain weight? When you're at that point, first of all, if you're at that point, that's a point where you should probably get professional help, which I was not able to get access to, unfortunately. But if you're at the point where you're so obsessed with your body size that it's debilitating that you can't get through your day, like that is so horrible. So to be able to move through your day and just be like, my body got me through the day and I'm happy with that. Like that's cool.
It is. Well, I have to tell you, first of all, thank you so much for joining me and being so transparent about everything. I know that it's not always easy subjects to talk about, but I always appreciate when I find people who are comfortable talking about it because there are so many people who are not, but just hearing it reflected back to them makes them feel a little bit better. And I love that you started the Delaware Fat Collective for everyone here in Delaware. Can you sort of just tell us a little bit about what you see for the future of it? And I know there's an event coming up, so can you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mentioned the Fat Collective is, well, it's very, very new. I mean, we only had our first event in January, and I have a full-time job and I'm working on a campaign right now, and it's taking up a lot of my capacity. But my hope is that, let me not move my camera. That's a force of habit. My hope for the collective is that it's a space, both virtually and hopefully in the future physically, where people can find community and fun, because fun is so important. You can't do activism without fun. You have to have fun. You have to find joy. I'm listening to Everything About Love, I think is what it's called, by Bell Hooks. And she was talking about something about like people that love doom. And like we all can be very cynical, but you have to find love and you have to find joy to keep going. And I think that's really true. And so I want it to be a space for fun and joy, but I also want it to be a space for people to kind of do that work of getting body size discrimination eliminated in the United States and in Delaware, which is a very real possibility for next year. The bill has already been drafted, and that's something that we're working towards. Then what looking forward, my hope is that we'll start having monthly meetings in person and, in person and also virtually. I'm hopefully securing a space for that this week. So we'll hopefully start having like monthly meetings, just being more consistent, having in-person events. We're going to be tabling at Pride in the Park on June 22nd in Wilmington. So we'll have a table there with coloring and, like, what's it called? It's the end of the day. Coloring pages.
Yeah.
Also have the ability to sign the Eliminate Body Size Discrimination petition through NAFA, stuff like that. And then tomorrow we're having an event at 7 p.m. at one of our members' house that is a screening of Your Fat Friends documentary, which is a really cool documentary that just came out. And we only have a few spots left, but if you're interested, the Instagram is at DE Fat Collective on Instagram, and we're still accepting responses for that. So yeah, just trying to create a space for fun and then for advocacy, because you have to have fun to do the work.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so, so much for joining. I appreciate your conversation and this time. Thank you to all of those who have watched at home. Please come back next Thursday. I'll have another great, I'll actually have a therapist with me to talk about gender identity and sexual identity. So that should be a great conversation. And if you list last week, we talked about religion and sexual identity and the intermix of all that with mental health. So check that out. Thank you for checking out this week. And also, Feel Good Talk, we are having a party on July 27th. So if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, please get your tickets. We're going to be all in white on a boat having fun. So tickets are still available for that. Thank you all and have a great evening.
Thanks.